Yes, the same PowerPoint again. I warned you earlier in the term that you're going to be seeing this one on POCO relationships come up multiple times throughout the term because we're examining different types of relationships between entities and how those were reflected in our plain old CLR objects, our model classes that we're writing, right? So now we're going to talk about that one-to-one. Okay, so a one-to-one, okay? As I said, you're not as common as like our one-to-manys. We see them everywhere. One-to-one relationship is very useful, okay, for modeling many real-world systems. But it can also be used to, as I said here, offload rarely accessed properties out of the principal entity into a dependent entity, right? So that we can do a dot include if we want, say, that profile picture for the patient, but not include it if we don't. And that makes our patient much, much smaller, okay, if we don't include it. All right. So most one-to-one relationships are technically 1-to-0 or 1, by the way, okay, because we don't necessarily have to include it, right? And we don't necessarily even have to have it, okay? Its existence is optional, okay? It's not a required, right? Now, there's more than one way that we can actually model a one-to-one relationship in Entity Framework Core. So let's talk about a couple of different ones. We're going to suppose this. An author has a biography, right? Now, that biography might be pages and pages and pages of information, okay? Every time we want to pull up a list of authors, maybe to populate a drop-down list to choose the author out of the list, well, all we probably need are the name components in that case, right? We don't need that huge biography every single time we want to pull up a list of authors. So what we could do is we could have a nullable biography property, okay? Biography is a separate class, and we may or may not include it in the author. So how does that biography look and how does it relate back? Well, basically, it could be simple as this. Now, at first glance, you might think, hey, that looks just like a one-to-many relationship. What is different, okay? Well, it is almost the same, right, as a one-to-many, except instead of an I collection of the dependent entity, we have a single one stored in the principal class. So you notice in author, we only have one biography. Hence, it's a 1-to-0 or 1 in this case, because it's not required to have a biography, right? Okay. But the foreign key looks pretty much the same. We have our required int, the author ID. So if we do have a biography created, instance of this biography entity, it will have a required integer for the author ID, right? And of course, we could possibly also include the author in it, right? But we don't necessarily have to. So that's a nullable object for the author. Now, in this arrangement, okay, the dependent entity here, our biography, has its own integer identity primary key, right? But the system would automatically, if we model this, Entity Framework Core will automatically add a unique index on the author ID property in biography. In other words, it will make sure that, we don't have two biographies for the same author, even though it has its own integer primary key. All right, so that's one way that we can actually model it, and this does work, right? However, an alternate design, which probably has some advantages, right? Now, it's still technically a 1-to-0 or 1. The author doesn't look any different, okay? We have our ID, our primary key of the author, our nullable biography object that is contained inside there. But what we can do is this, okay? We could simply make a required integer still, the biography ID, right? But we can annotate it, that this is the key and also functions as the foreign key. Our foreign key for what? For the author property contained inside biography, right? So we have the nullable author object in here, right? And this means we don't have to worry about generating another unique identity, okay, for the actual biography primary key. The foreign key does dual purpose. The biography ID is the foreign key relating back to the ID of the author, and at the same time it functions as the primary key of the biography. Hence, there's no need for an extra secondary unique constraint, okay, on the foreign key. All right, so it achieves the same relationship as the foreign key, and the dependent entity also serves as the primary key, right? the value of biography ID will match the ID of the author. It will not be an identity, so it won't be generated by the system. It will inherit that value from the actual author. Okay, just thought I'd share one more example. This is not one we're going to use so much directly, but another situation where one-to-ones come into play. Let's suppose we have a general animal class, right? Now, different types of animals have certain properties that are unique to the type of animal. So if our animal was a horse, right, versus a sheep, there might be additional properties that we would have just for horse. Okay, so example, if it's a horse, we might need a property, say, for, I don't know how often there's a term furlong speed. So how long does this horse run in a furlong of distance, right? For sheep, maybe there's properties about the quality of the wool of the sheep. Well, that would not be applicable if the horse was an animal, and a furlong speed would not be applicable if it was a sheep. So what we'll often do is break out using one-to-one, multiple one-to-one relationships, okay, the animal entity with multiple subordinate entities, okay, or dependent entities, right? So inside the horse and sheep entities, in addition to the navigation properties you see on the screen, that's where you would store things like furlong speed for a horse and wool quality for the sheep and things like that, right? I just thought I'd share so you don't think that one-to-ones are only there for offloading bulky information that isn't always required. There's many other reasons why we might resort to or make good use of this one-to-one type of relationship. All right, well, that's enough now. Let's get into actually coding using our one-to-one relationship as we build an example of file upload.